Welcome everyone to our webinar for today. This is part of our STEM in the Classroom webinar series here at Kent ISD. And today's topic is design thinking. And we have our presenters, Rick Mushing, who's a STEM consultant here at Kent ISD, and then Christopher Bruce. He's the School Program Senior Coordinator at the Grand Rapids Art Museum. And he's a little hard to see behind me. He's hidden behind that big monitor, so he's peeking up, but you'll see both Rick and Christopher a little bit better after I finish my introduction here. So a couple things before we get started, and if you were here early, you've heard a couple of these things already. Off to the bottom left part of your screen, you can see the attendee list. If you want to send a private message to someone, you can do so. Simply click on their name and then click on Start Private Chat. And you can use that feature as well to contact me, which, by the way, I'm Andrew Steinman. I'm one of the EdTech consultants here, and I'm actually the moderator for today's webinar. So if you have any technical issues, please contact me. You can share in the chat or send me a private message off to the left-hand side. In the top left, you can see the video, and then the top right, we have the slide deck for today. And then at the bottom, we have our chat. And so this is how you will communicate with each other, as well as the presenters and myself for today's webinar. So if you have any questions for the presenters or for the group, I encourage you to put them into the chat. There'll be 2 Q&A sessions for today's webinar, and during that time we will take the questions that have been asked, and I will ask those questions to our presenters. So please don't worry if they don't address your question right away. They will address the question at one of the 2 Q&A portions. And I think I mentioned this before, but if you have a question that you want to share anonymously, you can do so by starting a private chat with me and just sending me your question, and I'll add it to our queue. Because what I'll do is I will read off the questions to our moderators to answer. The last thing I want to share is that these different areas will move around through today's webinar. Just to give you a little preview, when our presenters start to present, I'm going to switch to this mode here so you can see the presentation a little bit better. Everything that you saw is still here, it's just rearranged. So I just want to give you a heads up that I'll be doing that throughout today's webinar. And if at any point maybe the video is too small and you want it to be bigger, or the presentation is too small, you want it to be bigger, you can see towards the top right of those windows, there's those arrows that are facing in 4 different directions. You can click on that button to make that window full screen. And then you can click on it again to reduce it back to its normal size. So I think that's everything. If you have any questions for me in the webinar, please just throw them in the chat or send me a private message. Again, if you have questions for our presenters, use the chat, or if you want to share ask anonymously, do so by sending me a private chat. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things off to our presenters, and they will introduce themselves and talk about themselves a little bit more. And so I will see you guys at the end of today's webinar. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. As Andrew mentioned, I'm Rick Mushing. I'm a STEM consultant with the Kent ISD. And we are very fortunate to have with us today Chris Bruce. He is the School Program Senior Coordinator for the Grand Rapids Art Museum, the GRAM we call it here in Grand Rapids. The ISD is going to provide a series of these webinars based on STEM activities and STEM resources. And we wanted to start out the series talking about design thinking. Design thinking is one of the fundamental processes and tools used in a lot of STEM lessons and project-based learning itself. And I've seen Chris present this topic to students. He's very good at it and a perfect person to start off the seminar series with. Nope, we just introduced ourselves, so we'll move on from that. Objectives, talking about the components of design thinking, applying the design thinking process. In addition to giving an overview of what design thinking is and how we use that and how Chris uses it at the GRAM, we're going to talk about some lesson examples and how you could possibly use it in your classrooms. Our agenda today generally looks like this. We may vary a bit. We both get a little long-winded, so Generally, we're talking about the design thinking concepts, the components involved in the design thinking, and then going through some questions with you. All right, Christopher, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Rick, and hello, everyone. This is my second webinar ever, so I apologize for how awkward this is going to be. I'm not used to talking to a computer. But I wanted to start a little bit just talking about what GRAM is and what we do at the museum. GRAM is the Grand Rapids Art Museum. We are located here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We have a collection that is predominantly American art. However, we are opening sort of internationally and primarily contemporary art at the moment. But our goal is really to open our resources up to the community. And we do that in a variety of ways. We like to say that we are in the business of building relationships. We want our local students, and by local I mean the state of Michigan, to know that GRAM is there for them. And so we have developed many programs, some of which you are seeing on the slide now, to meet their needs. And that's really our focus, is fulfilling needs. Here you can see some examples of art-based lessons that we've developed. We work with schools, we work with families, we work with other arts and cultural organizations to ensure that everyone has access to the resources that we have. We do not want to hold a monopoly on the knowledge that we have. And we do that with adults as well. This is a program called Creativity Uncorked. It is not a professional development program, but I thought you might be interested in it anyway. It is for adults. It involves drinking and art making. If you are interested, I encourage you to check out our website. There is an educational component as well, but you're not going to be able to renew any licenses by participating in this particular program. And I also wanted to share with you, last year we launched a new website geared specifically for educators. It's called GRAM Educator Home. The web address is simply grameducatorhome.org. It is a private online professional learning community. It's sort of a one-stop shop for anything that an educator could need from the museum. It opens our resources up very tangibly. It allows easy access around your schedule to our resources. And I encourage you to check it out if you're interested. The first time you visit it, you're going to think this is a terribly designed, hideous website because there is nothing on it. You have to register before you can access the materials. So you'll be greeted with a blank blue screen and a prompt to create an account before you can access the materials. I promise it gets better from there. But design thinking, that's really why we are here today. Design thinking is a process, it's a mindset, it's a way to solve problems creatively. A little background as to why I'm sitting here talking about this is a few years ago, we had an exhibition entitled Graphic Design, now in production, that came to the museum. And one of my jobs is creating professional development experiences for each of our changing exhibitions. Traditionally, they are media-based. And what I mean by that is that whatever tools an artist use to create a work of art, we then create a professional development around those tools so that we can train teachers to create works of art or incorporate those methods into their classroom in the same way as those artists were. Graphic Design, now in production, gave us some challenges. These were technology-based media. They were created on computers using Photoshop and Adobe Creative Suite, tools that we don't have available for all of our participants, and for many of our participants being area educators, they don't have access to as well. So instead of focusing on the actual material being used in the work of art, we focused on the designer's thinking process. So how do they approach a problem or a goal, and how do they go about fulfilling that goal? You'll hear me use the words problem, goal, and need sort of interchangeably. We try and shy away from the word problem because problem tends to have negative connotations with it. Instead, we want to focus on a need. So in design thinking, we're trying to identify what that need is, and then how can we go about fulfilling that need. When we talk about need, it also helps us identify underlying issues that we may not necessarily focus on right away. One example that I use quite prevalently with educators is the teacher's lounge. And I ask them, what is a problem that you need solved within the teacher's lounge? And 90% of the time I hear, we need more couches in the teacher's lounge. It's an uncomfortable area. We don't like to spend time in there. And I push it right back on them. Do you really need more couches? What is the purpose of the teacher's lounge? What do you really need from it? And inevitably we get to a point where it's an area to relax. It's an area to collaborate. It's an area to share what's happening in my classroom with my colleagues and see how we can support one another. A couch does not solve any of that. It allows you to sit. So there may be other areas that we can examine more. So design thinking starts with that need. If we don't know what need we're trying to fulfill, there's no purpose in going through the design thinking cycle. Now, when I use that term cycle very specifically, because design thinking never ends. There never is an end result. We bring whatever product we create, whatever end result comes out of the cycle, and we put it right back through the cycle. We're always trying to improve what we've created. I've illustrated for you the design thinking cycle here. This is the cycle that Graham uses. Design thinking can go by many names and consists of many different steps depending on who you ask. When we adopted this particular cycle at the museum, it was because we were working with IDEO, a design firm out of California. And if you want to look that up, it's actually IDEO, but pronounced IDEO. And they had adopted this particular cycle, and they were making these resources available to all educators free of charge. So if you go to designthinking.org or designthinkingforeducators.org, you'll have access to all of the resources that IDEO has put out there, and these are the same resources that we've used at the museum. It is about an 80-page document that goes into specifics as to what should take place in each of these steps. I've shared with Rick, who will share with you after this, Graham's version of that 80-page document, which is 8 pages, and 1 page in particular that really goes in depth into each of these steps. But I want to start, for the purposes of this conversation, with the discovery phase. Discovery is all about understanding what that need is. We frame that need, and we create what is called a design brief. It's a call to action. It is what we're going to use as we research and explore. And that research takes place within this discovery phase. When people think of designers coming up with solutions, they typically don't think of this discovery stage. They think of prototyping, they think of creating, they think of brainstorming, but discovery is the bedrock of all of that. The longer you stay in the discovery stage, the more research you find, the easier design thinking is going to be. This is something we also see our students sort of gloss over. Research isn't the most enjoyable experience always, but the more we can do it, the easier our process is going to be. Once we understand our problem or need, and we've gathered all of that research, we move into interpretation. And this is making sense of the data. We, in design thinking, refer to it as telling stories. We try and keep in mind that any data we collect is almost always people-driven. And we try and look at that data through the perspective of the individuals. In design thinking, we are creating for someone else. Almost 90% of the time, we're not creating to fulfill our personal need. we're creating for someone else. And it's important to put our misconceptions or prior experiences or bias that we may have aside and try and put ourselves in the shoes of the person we're creating for. For that reason, design thinking teaches empathy amazingly well. And it's been my experience in talking with educators that empathy is something our students are lacking, and that anything we can do to help them experience the world from someone else's point of view is time well spent. And design thinking is one way that we can do that. In this interpretation stage, we also start framing our opportunities. This is that information that we're going to use to then build off of to brainstorm. So we look for the trends and we try and pull a few items out of the mix that we're going to focus on later. Then we move into ideation. Rick, also feel free to interrupt me at any point if you want to add to this.
Well,
because I'm talking a lot and I realize that already.
yeah, and you're doing a great job. And I just wanted to add, and Cheryl Dreyer added in the comments also, the point about empathy, engineering is recognizing that also. So Christopher and I come from different worlds. I'm the engineering background and Christopher is more in the art world. And the engineering world has recognized a lot that in our design processes, we need to develop those creative, innovative thinkers. And empathy is one of the things we don't typically explore in engineering.
Mm-hmm.
I went to engineering college. I was there for 5 years, and I never heard the term, I think, when I was up there. And now we hear it a lot. And design thinking, like you said, is perfect for interjecting that into these projects we've had that can be very technical, but it does get that perspective of the other person, what you're designing for. And it's often a big misconception of our students that when they get out in the real world and they're designers, they're designing what they want to. Well, like Christopher said, they're not. They are designing for somebody who has some very specific needs. And that's what this process helps them discover.
Wonderful.
So continue on. Doing
Thank
great.
you. So after this interpretation stage, we move into ideation. This is often referred to as brainstorming. This is where we come up with different ideas. And at this point, it's very important that we are almost ignoring the constraints of the problem. We're not worrying about how much is this going to cost? How much time is this going to take? What resources do we have at our disposal? The process will acknowledge that throughout, and those outlandish ideas will fall to the side. But in the very early stages of ideation, we are wildly throwing ideas out there. And what's great about ideation is that there are no wrong ideas. So it's a safe place for students to explore really wild and creative ideas without worry of people making fun of them, judging them for these strange, often ideas. And it's also just a lot of fun. We use design thinking at the museum all the time. In fact, we are so passionate about design thinking that last year we wrote it into our strategic plan. So we have committed Graham to not only teach design thinking, but to use it internally in all that we do, which sometimes can be very, very frustrating as we're now teaching our staff what design thinking is and how to use it. But once everyone's on the same page, it really moves our mission forward and allows us to be much more productive as well. And in this ideation stage, after we throw out all of the ideas, and this can be anywhere from 5 minutes to 5 weeks of just brainstorming. It all depends on the constraints of the problem and how much time you can set aside for this. I'm saying a lot, which I'm now noticing, and I hate that about myself.
You're getting the point across well.
It's going to be worse now that I've acknowledged it.
Yep.
And we refine our ideas. From there, we look at them through the lens of how much money do we have? How much time do we have? What resources can we set aside for these? What's actually going to work? And we also reevaluate it from the perspective of the user. Who is actually going to be doing this? Is this an idea that Chris thinks is wonderful, but Rick, who we're actually designing for, is never going to use? And we have to acknowledge that. And sometimes we have to put aside what we really want to do because we think it's cool, and do what is actually going to work. And that can be very difficult. And I found that the process is easier with more people involved. Design thinking is a collaborative project. At every point in the cycle, you should be working with people. If you're working with your end user, who you're designing for, that's wonderful. That's a perfect situation because you can get their feedback immediately. But that's not always the case. But you should have individuals that you can bounce ideas off of. From there, we move to experimentation. This is my favorite part. And this is what most people think of when they think of the work of designers. This is prototyping. This is building. This is creating and trying and testing and seeing if it's actually going to work. In experimentation, we want to be very careful about using too many resources in order to create a prototype. I like to say a prototype should be made within 5 minutes and not cost us anything. It should be items that we have every day around us. One story that I like to tell illustrating that is we worked with a company here in West Michigan, and I won't tell you what company that is, but you might be able to figure it out, that creates medical devices. And they were creating these new forceps, and they invested months of time in prototyping every different kind of forceps that you could imagine, and nothing was working. And they were sitting in a conference room talking about, why is this not functioning? Why can't we figure out the solution to this problem? And they decided that they were going to try one more idea using materials in the room. So they got a rubber band. I think someone had a spool of thread in their pocket randomly, and 2 whiteboard markers. And they put the markers on the spool of thread, tied it together with a rubber band, and started experimenting with this new method. That actually led to the end result that is now being used in hospitals across the country. The months of super refined 3D printed prototypes led nowhere. So in experimentation, we don't need to invest a lot of time and money. We just want to get an idea out there. I have in my office what I call my design thinking toolkit. It contains Sharpie markers, pipe cleaners, Post-it notes, and air dry clay. And whenever I go to a classroom or work with a group of teachers talking about design thinking, I bring this toolkit. It costs the museum probably $10 for all of the materials in it, and we've been using it for years. And that's our monetary investment in getting this out there. It can be that cheap and that easy, but it allows you to create something tangible to test immediately. In experimentation, you should get your prototype in the hands of your user to try and get feedback immediately. Once we're done with experimentation, we move on to evolution. And I use that word done almost sarcastically because we're never really done with any of this. As I said, it's a cycle. So we'll jump through the cycle many, many times before we have an actual end result. From there, we move on to evolution. This is observing your prototype in action. At this point, we still haven't invested in an end result. We don't know if what we've prototyped is going to be a reality. We may have multiple prototypes. We're just testing it out. But we are observing it. We're getting feedback. We're making minor changes to it to see if we can refine it. And we're trying to come up with something that's actually going to fulfill that need. At the end of evolution, we'll have one idea that the team typically identifies as the right one, and we'll use that. And that could be pitching it to our employer. That could be trying to manufacture something. That could be creating a new idea or lesson plan to use in our classroom. Design thinking can be used for anything. If there is a need out there, then you can use the design thinking cycle to try and come up with a solution for that. I've worked with educators who have adopted this cycle as their lesson plan template. So for each lesson that they're doing in a classroom, there's a discovery phase, there's an interpretation phase, there's ideation, there's experimentation, and there's evolution. So the kids are taking a very active role in their learning, and they're shaping the lessons as they go. As I mentioned earlier, design thinking doesn't end. It is a cycle and it repeats. So once we have our idea, we go out there and we start researching that object in action, that experience out in the wild, out in the field, and we then reevaluate it through the entire cycle again. We reinterpret it, we come up with more ideas, we do more prototypes based off of what we learned through that first cycle. At some point, because of the limitations of the world we live in, we likely have to say enough is enough, and where we are is what we're going to live with. But theoretically, you could always refine an idea and make it better. That, in a nutshell, is design thinking. That is 80 pages of information from IDEO in a couple minutes. This is something that takes practitioners years and years and years of doing to really understand. I've been using this cycle specifically for about 3 years now, and every single time I've done it, I've learned something more about it, and I've changed how I approach it. I got into a debate just this afternoon with my boss about how design thinking should actually be implemented. And I threw out there, I don't think you're really doing design thinking. I think you need to reevaluate this. So it's an evolving process.
So Christopher spent a lot of time going through this because it is, like I said, the foundation of the STEM and problem-based learning. And he's got some tools he's going to show you to help you evolve this process and apply it to what you're doing in your classroom. I'm looking forward to a couple of these graphs. Go ahead and...
Yep. Let's go on. Static objects. And so we want to teach through those objects. This is an object that was part of the graphic design now in production exhibition. This is an infographic. This one in particular is open source. It's available online. I encourage you to use it in your classroom to illustrate some of the ideas that I'm going to cover. But it really succinctly demonstrates the process that designers have to go through. We like to approach design thinking sort of in reverse. We have an object, and we want to figure out or take a guess at what the designer went through in order to end at that object. And to do that, we ask ourselves some very specific questions about the object to try and put ourselves in the shoes of the designer. Once again, trying to feel empathy for their point of view. So some of those questions include, who was this object created for? So in the case of this particular work of art, we would look at its individual parts. We see there's a title with it, The True Size of Africa. We see there's an image. It depicts the outline of Africa with individual countries represented within it. We see that there are tables with data, and we start to take guesses as to who might this object have been created for. Rick, where do you imagine you could potentially see this object?
In a classroom right away, I think one of the things students recognize immediately is students tend to think America, the United States, is the largest country. Yep. It's the big country. We're it. But it really quickly illustrates that geographically, we're pretty small.
Yep. Yeah, so this is an object that we could potentially see in a classroom, perhaps in a textbook. And so from there, we start to look at the individual decisions and sometimes it's easier for us to answer that question if we look at it from a different point of view. So I want you to imagine this object devoid of color. Think of it as black and white and grayscale. How does that change our perception of this object? With color, it's very engaging. We as individuals are often drawn towards color. Black and white is a little more boring. Maybe if this was black and white, it wouldn't grab our attention as much. Maybe we would avoid the image itself and look at the text. We can see that use of color as a way to engage our audience. So here, the artist knowing their audience, and in this case, this object was really created for everyone. It was intended to be viewed on the internet, so you could see these relationships. It was intended to demonstrate very visually and succinctly that Africa is significantly larger than what the average individual thinks it is. This is not due to the fact that our geography classes are not teaching our students properly. That's not the case at all. This is due to the fact that the maps that we use have to manipulate the world in some way in order to depict our globe, which is spherical, on a flat plane. And because of that, Africa has become squished in proportion to the other continents and countries, when in actuality it is very, very large. Another reason that I use this particular object is to talk about being conscious consumers of information. We look at this, and 99% of the individuals that I have shown this to will accept it as fact immediately. There's no question. There's tables, there's charts, there's numbers. Someone has obviously done their research. They know what they're talking about. Well, if you get really close to it and look at the detail and look at the information, it's actually not as accurate as we would hope it would be. Yes, Africa is huge, and these countries really could fit into it, but the actual information within the charts themselves are inaccurate. This information was pulled from Wikipedia, not the most credible source available to us. But it illustrates that how we present something is often very important for how people perceive it. If we put it out there in a very factual manner, people are going to assume it's actually factual. Another question we like to pose when looking at objects is, do we think this is successful? Does this object get its message across, therefore fulfilling the need that the artist intended? In this case, the need was getting more, I don't want to say accurate, as I've already said this object is inaccurate, but illustrating this notion that there is this disparity in how we perceive the world and how the world actually is out there. And one could argue that yes, despite the factual discrepancies, this object is effective in that. If we say something isn't effective, then we once again put ourselves in the shoes of the designer and ask, well, how could this be more effective? What changes could we make that would appeal to our audience more, that would get the information across more directly? How can we improve upon what the artist has already given us? Rick, would you like to add anything to that?
No, it's a very good graphic.
It's beautiful, right?
Yeah.
I love it.
The colors do add a lot.
So another question that I'm asked a lot is, well, what's the role of creativity in this process? Is there such a thing as creativity? Can creativity be taught? The answer is yes and yes. Creativity exists. Creativity can be taught. There are lots of different ways to do that. I like to start by sort of framing what is creativity. Each of us has a different idea of what creativity means. There are no right or wrong answers to what creativity is. The typical consensus is that it's about problem solving. It's about being able to come up with new and interesting ideas. I like to temper that with the fact that those ideas should work. So coming up with ideas that we actually can use as opposed to just wild and crazy ideas. Creativity is also about being able to overcome our stumbling blocks. So what do we do when we hit a wall, when we can't come up with new ideas, when we have questions that we just can't seem to answer? Who is creative? I argue that everyone is creative. Not everyone is going to agree with that, but I think everyone is inherently creative. We just may not express it, and there are some tips and tricks that I'll share with you on how you can be a little more creative. And then right there, how can we become more creative is really the impetus for the next few images I have to show you. Googling how I can be more creative comes up with a lot of really interesting results. I encourage you to try it sometime. That's actually how I came up with this image. I was asked to do sort of a similar experience to this with a group of students from Davenport University with the focus specifically on ideation and creativity. And I found this particular image to be very interesting. And it's a journey path of individual things you can do every single day to help put you in a creative mindset, to help break down those barriers that we often place on ourselves. And they're there for practical reasons. There's stresses in our lives. There's deadlines we have to meet. Interestingly enough, I think deadlines can be one of the greatest proponents for creative thinking. I get my best ideas when I have to present something 5 minutes from now and I have no idea what I'm doing. I've also found that taking your mind off of the problem at hand is a great way to think more creatively. I'm working currently at the museum with a group of educators to develop a new curriculum for a local school district. And we met 2 hours yesterday to focus on what's our goal, what are the constraints we have, and how are we going to get there. And then when we left, I asked them each to go home, to spend a day not thinking about this idea, and then at some point to just relax and take a shower. Do a mundane everyday task and let your mind wander, and I promise you will come up with the best ideas during those moments. I cannot tell you how many experiences like this, how many professional developments I've planned, just taking a shower and not focusing on the issue at hand. I encourage you to check out this particular image. We'll make all of these slides available to you so you can go through. I'm promising that that's possible, right?
Yep.
Yes,
Yep.
okay. We'll make all of these available to you.
And along the lines of creativity, some of the stuff you just said really resonated with me. Before teaching, I wrote a lot of software. And one thing I learned pretty early on in my career, I used to battle through software problems. I used to sit at the office, stay there late, work my way through the problems. Often I got through them, sometimes I didn't. The more and more I did that as the years went by, I started to realize, like you just said, if I walked away from that problem, I'd come back the next morning and have a solution right away. Mm-hmm. So rather than spending 4 hours battling through something, changing my mindset, doing something different. I used to keep a little pad of paper, and this was before iPads and everything else. So I had to keep a pad of paper by my bed, write those ideas down when I was not thinking, not there trying to solve it. Come back the next day, and I did in 5 minutes.
Doesn't come when you want it to.
Yeah.
I think that's something we have to accept.
No matter how hard you push. Yep.
Yep. And the harder you push, the more likely you're not going to come up with a solution. Here's another image that talks about different things you can do to become more creative. Some of them I think are really interesting. Number 13, collaborate. Collaboration is key to a lot of elements within the design thinking cycle, and collaboration builds creativity. Number 12, get feedback. Open your ideas up to other people. They can build on those ideas. Number 4, I think we don't do enough. Get away from the computer. We tend to focus on the idea or the answers out there. I'm going to Google this. I'm going to search for this. There's some sort of software that can answer this for me. But that's not always true. And I think number 28, that last one, have fun, is something we forget. We get bogged down in the details, and we forget that we're doing what we're doing to a degree because we enjoy it and because it's fun. And our best ideas can come out of that when we're just messing around, having fun, playing around with colleagues. So I have a few tools I want to go over with you. These are based specifically in the ideation phase of design thinking, but they're also great tools to get creativity flowing. These are tools that we use at the museum quite frequently. But before I get there, I'm jumping ahead. There are some rules for ideation. These come directly from IDEO. The first one, defer judgment. There is no right or wrong answer. Everything is great. Encourage wild ideas. Build on the ideas of others. We like to say you cannot say no, and you cannot say but when you're ideating. You can say yes and. Yes, that's a great idea, and have you considered this? Stay focused on the topic. It is super easy to get distracted when you're having fun and ideating, so try and maintain focus as much as possible. One conversation at a time. This is once again related to that stay focused idea. It's easy to have side conversations when everyone's excited about sharing their ideas, but it's important that all ideas get heard, because Rick conversation, we're never going to be able to cross-pollinate those ideas. And then be visual. Drawing is wonderful for ideating. It allows you to really think through a problem more than just writing it out. This does not mean you need to be an artist. You don't even need to be comfortable with your artistic ability. Just sketch ideas, get ideas out there quick and succinctly. Okay, so the first activity is called brainwriting. Rick and I were talking about brainwriting earlier. There's a lot of words on this slide. Feel free to ignore them now. You can read them later if you'd like. But brainwriting is a great way to honor those in the room who may not be the loudest or most assertive, and to make sure that those individuals who are the loudest are not dominating the conversation, which we know so often happens. Brainwriting begins by everyone sitting around in a circle or in small groups. Each person has a card, and on that card they write down one potential solution to the problem at hand. They pass that card to the person on their right or left, it doesn't matter. And that person then has to read the first person's response and add to it. You can't come up with a brand new idea. You have to build on that idea. This process continues by passing the card around the room until we get to a point where we no longer think we can build on that idea. We set that idea aside and we start with a fresh idea, and we continue to do this for a set amount of time. At the end of that, we read through all the results to see how we built on each other's ideas and what ideas grew out of that process. We also have the anti-problem. This is personally my favorite brainstorming technique. And the anti-problem is the exact opposite of what you think you would do. Instead of trying to solve a problem, you try and solve the opposite of that problem. So one problem that we face at Graham is attendance. How do we get people through our doors? And we brainstorm about this idea all the time, but sometimes we get to a point where we're stuck and we no longer think of any good ideas. So instead, we brainstorm the anti-problem. How do we ensure that no one ever comes back to our building again? And we've come up with some very interesting ideas, including like armed sentries at the door, just locking the doors. These are not solutions to our problem, but they get you thinking more creatively, and they're fun because there's zero pressure. You know you're not coming up with solutions. You're just having fun and sharing ideas. And once that pressure's off, you can think more creatively, and we can come back to our problem after we've taken a little break. And many times, you'll find that there actually are solutions to your initial problem in the anti-problem simply by rephrasing them and sort of looking at the anti-problem. These two techniques were taken from a book called Gamestorming. There's also a wonderful website that has the entire contents of the book available online if you just Google Gamestorming. And they are wonderful, quick activities that you can do to help become more creative and help brainstorm. Essentially, it's game storming, so it's a little more fun than just your traditional brainstorming. But those are some ideas for how you can incorporate these creativity techniques very quickly and easily, and cheaply, I might add.
That's really good. I had not heard of this one before, and I can just see how to generate the thought process.
Oh yeah,
People just get
it's a
involved in
lot
the
of
thought
fun.
process, and like you said, reversing it at the end, you might have your solution.
Mm-hmm. All right, and now we have some time, I think, right, for a few questions at this point, and then we'll also have time at the very end for more.
Yep. One of the questions that came up, will we have all these notes available? And what I'll do, I've got all your emails, so I'll put together the PowerPoint. We don't really have any notes, but I'll put together the PowerPoint and put that in a Google Doc, Google folder, and share that out with the group. And I'll put up some different worksheets and maybe some of the graphics also that we're using in this PowerPoint. And what are some of the other questions we had in here? Okay, we'll have a question session at the end of this also. I think I'll move on. We just had a couple quick examples, and these are things that I'm currently using in schools, or I've seen other teachers use, or work with other teachers on. And all of them are based on project-based learning, and they're all STEM examples. One of the things I'm doing a lot right now is STEM development, STEM coding with students, software coding with students. And these are some of the tools I use for that. In K-12, code.org is an incredible site. I think a lot of people have been on that. Khan Academy also. But what I'm finding a lot of people haven't seen yet is the app Inventor. And what I like to do, and even with my high school classes, I'll start with code.org and start with the real simple stuff like the Frozen game or the Flappy Bird, and show even the older students how the basic logic of code works. And then moving on to App Inventor, and these graphics on the screen are the interface for building code in App Inventor, and it's real similar to what you'll see in code.org with the lower end games, the simpler games, but the difference is the sky's the limit on this. You can write a ton of applications just with App Inventor, and students pick it up very quickly. Within a couple hours, they're writing their own code, they understand what they're doing. It's been a really handy tool. And one of the reasons I do so much with coding in schools is that it's so big in industry. Just about every industry you're in is going to have some type of software application, and the workers are either using an application every day or they're looking for an application that might refine their processes. So I do a lot with code on the schools. Also 3D modeling and printing. 3D modeling, we've got free software, and I'll talk a little bit about some different programs out there, but free software is available to all schools now, and this is software cost $5,000 2 years ago. Now it's free to schools. We've got a lot of modeling software and a lot of simple software. Grades as young as, I've got K through 4 on there, and I've only worked with as young as 3rd grade, but 3rd graders have picked up the modeling software, and the real simple stuff is just using shapes and putting those shapes together sort of like clay, but doing it on a computer. And the graphic on this page is one of my favorite projects by a student. This was actually Northview. 2 students there, the whole class was given an open design problem, design whatever you want, use the design thinking process. These 2 students wanted to build a French fry holder for their car. I thought it was just a brilliant idea. It was in the middle of winter, so they wanted to get their French fries, dump them in that cup, and those 2 little fingers hanging out the end there, they wanted to plug those into their hot air vent on their car, and the air would blow with the fries and keep their fries warm while they were driving. But here was one of the biggest lessons the whole class got out of this. So this was an exciting design example, but when they printed this with a 3D printer, it came out about as big as a teaspoon. They didn't realize when they were in the computer and they drew something that had a 1-inch diameter, they didn't really grasp what 1 inch was, but when they had it in their hand, they could see what 1 inch was, and it's going to be far too small. Another thing they noticed about this, and by the way, that little small cup on the side, I didn't get it at first, but that's for their ketchup. So they had their fries and their ketchup all in one holder. But another big benefit of 3D printing when they got this part is I asked them to go out and install this in the car and see how it fit in there. But you can see from the shape it's conical, and what happened to them when they tried to push that into the vent, it squeezed out of their hand right away. So they knew they needed something to hold it a little better, and they wouldn't have known that if they hadn't had the chance to print that part out. So 3D printing and 3D modeling, doing that a lot also, and it's free. Another big thing I'm using right now is data visualization, GIS, Geographic Information Systems. And I've talked to some classes about autonomous vehicles vehicles driving themselves. This is going to be one of the big technologies behind that market, and that market hopefully is going to be really huge in Michigan. So it's something that our students are going to be able to take advantage of, and a very valuable skill they're going to have once they do go out and enter into the workforce. And we've got lessons for this on our LMS system, Edify. And you can access that, and I'll also put in that Google Doc, I'll put in access to the lessons on how to get into Edify. And one last thing I wanted to mention here, I mentioned those 3 applications I just went through. They were all software. We've got some other lessons that aren't software-based. You don't need a computer to run. But the reason I bring those up, in the last couple of years, a couple initiatives have hit. The White House Connected program, they actually donated or committed $1 billion worth of software to schools, and schools have taken very little advantage of this. Unfortunately, part of the problem has been, part of the problem has been computers and hardware. So the software is free, but you still do need the computer. Last March, a month ago, the Obama administration announced another STEM initiative, putting $240 million out there for different grants and scholarship programs. And then, of course, the universities are committing quite a bit of time into STEM initiatives, into working with schools. And I don't know if a lot of you have heard of the grand challenges, the grand engineering challenges. There's 14 grand engineering challenges that a lot of times universities will focus on those with their engineering students. And you can use those grand challenges in your rooms also. So if you haven't seen those yet, again, Google that, Grand Challenges. I think if you Google Grand Challenges Engineering, you actually get the website, and it'll outline 4 of the challenges that globally engineers, industry people, challenges that we think we're going to face in the next, in the upcoming century, in the next 10 years and 5 years. So pretty interesting to base some lessons off of that. Okay, so I think that's all we have for the presentation, and we can go ahead and take any of your questions. Like I said earlier, I answered one of the questions. We will post up on a Google site, and I will send you all an email to that site. And Andrew, is there any other questions that you noticed coming through here?
Yep, so just a reminder to everybody, if you have any questions, please start sharing them in the chat now, because we are going to have to end right at 5 o'clock. So we want to make sure that we get all your questions. One of the questions that came in earlier today was that we have a teacher that's interested in teaching a world language and culture through art. So it's really what they want to do to cover all the curriculum and the art activities and design thinking. Do you guys have any suggestions for that teacher or resources you could share?
Thinking. I think my suggestion is try and partner as best you can with local organizations. So for instance, the Public Museum here in Grand Rapids or the Art Museum, when you are able to bring students to the actual objects or the works of art, it's so much more powerful than bringing the images into the classroom. And there are plenty of organizations that are excited about partnerships of that nature. Any specifics, I don't know exactly off the top of my head, because that would depend a lot on the actual curriculum specifically that you're trying to fulfill. Did that answer that question at all?
And we do at the ISD, we've got, it's one of the services we provide is connecting schools with people in industry. We've got career exploration coordinators, career exploration coordinators, and that's what they do, is connect businesses with teachers, with schools. So if you're struggling to do that, get a hold of us, and we can set you up with one of those coordinators or one of those programs.
Looks like Chris is answering some questions through text.
Ooh, a link.
Yeah, that's pretty handy.
So, I'll let you answer that question before I ask the next one.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Good.
Okay, so the next question I had is let me make sure I'm saying it right. So can design thinking work at all grade levels and subject areas?
Yes.
Definitely agree with that also. Um, and this year, the youngest I work with were third graders. And I'm confident we can work with the younger students even than that. And I was really impressed, like the 3D printer. I went into a class of third graders with a 3D printer, and they had a ton of questions for me.
Mm-hmm.
They'd never seen it before. Just that natural curiosity. And as they developed those questions with the teacher, I was able to develop some lessons, and we went through a design thinking process with that group. One group solved, they had a problem with their greenhouse. The panels were blowing off every time the wind blew through. It was really disappointing for the kids. So the kids designed a clip to put on that greenhouse. We went through the design thinking process for that, and it went really well with that group. That was actually a fifth grade group, but we work with younger than that also.
Yeah, and we use design thinking in really all of our programs. We do have select experiences for students that are specific to design thinking, but we use the ideas of design thinking throughout all of our programs. And we've done it with students as young as preschool and kindergarten.
All right, Cheryl is typing right now, so she might have our last question for today. If you do have any other questions, please feel free to contact Rick or Chris after today's webinar, but we'll wait for Cheryl's question and then we'll wrap things up for the rest of the webinar.
And Cheryl's also one of our experts in the room. She's doing a lot with STEM up in her classroom.
Yes, Cheryl.
Oh,
I will check those dates when I get back to the office.
All right.
This is great. I want this service.
Yeah, very handy. And Andrew did point out to me, you can actually click those links to our emails. Avery and Kuba is the other STEM consultant here at the ISD. Avery's background is aviation, weather, earth sciences. He's got a lot of resources in that area, and I tend to cover more of the engineering type of applications.
So Rick or Chris, is there anything else you'd like to share before I wrap things up?
If you're interested in working with the museum or you want any more information, please feel free to reach out to us. You can always email me at cbruce@artmuseumgr.org. I like to tell educators that my sole purpose at the museum is to be there for them. So any questions you have, any things, programs, partnerships that you want to develop, let me know. There's something that we can do for you.
Very good. I think I'm all set. I think Andrew's got some closing comments for us.
All right. So thanks, Rick and Chris. Great webinar. If you guys have any other questions for them, you have Rick's email there, and Chris shared his earlier in the chat. I'm going to copy and paste it. I'm going to throw it right at the bottom of the chat so you can see it again. So that way you can contact Chris or Rick if you have additional questions. So to wrap things up, I want to say thank you for attending today's webinar. Rick and Chris also say thank you. You can see them in the background still. So if you could please take a moment to provide feedback on today's webinar. And you can do so by clicking on that green button right there. It's a live link. It'll take you straight to the survey. Just a short survey. Will just take a couple of minutes for you to fill out. And it will be helpful for both Rick and Chris to get some feedback on the content that they shared, as well as for us at Kent ISD for our future webinars. And if you're interested in attending a future webinar, our next webinar is happening next week. And this is from Craig Steenstra, one of our other ed tech consultants here at Kent ISD. And he's doing a webinar on digital literacy for educators. So really helping those teachers that with some, I guess, some basic skills of using technology with students in the classroom. So if you're not that comfortable using technology in your classroom, this is a great webinar to attend. And if you're interested in attending that webinar, you can click on that orange button right there to sign up. And with that, I want to say again, thank you for learning with us today. Hope to see you at our next webinar.